The Texas wind cut through the barbed wire fence like a blade, carrying with it the scent of prairie grass and diesel fuel. Inside Camp Hearne, winter 1944 had settled over the prisoner of war compound with a peculiar stillness. The war in Europe raged on. But here, in the heart of America, a different kind of battle was being fought, one waged in the hearts of broken men. Hans Müller sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the empty space where his left leg should have been. 24 years old, and his life felt over. The amputation had happened 3 months ago in a field hospital in Normandy, after shrapnel from an American artillery shell had torn through his calf. The German surgeons had worked quickly, efficiently, with the cold pragmatism of men who had seen too much. They saved his life but couldn't save his leg. Now he was here, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by other ghosts of the Wehrmacht. The barracks held 50 men, and at least a dozen were missing limbs. Some had lost arms at Stalingrad. Others, like Hans, had left pieces of themselves scattered across the beaches of France. They were the remnants of Hitler's grand vision, discarded and forgotten. Hans adjusted the crude wooden crutches that leaned against his bunk. An army carpenter had fashioned them from scrap lumber, and they dug painfully into his armpits whenever he moved. But moving was better than lying still, better than thinking about the future that stretched before him like a vast, empty plain. Across the aisle, Friedrich Becker struggled to pull on his boots. He had lost his right leg below the knee at Monte Cassino, and every simple task had become an ordeal. Friedrich was 42, old for a soldier, with a wife and 3 children waiting in Hamburg. If they were still alive, if Hamburg was still standing, the morning roll call bell rang, sharp and metallic in the cold air. Hans reached for his crutches, biting back a groan as he pulled himself upright. The camp guards were American soldiers, young men who looked at the German prisoners with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Hans understood. He would have felt the same. Outside, the prisoners assembled in ragged lines. The camp held nearly 4,000 men, arranged in neat rows of barracks that stretched across the flat Texas landscape. Guard towers loomed at each corner, their searchlights sweeping across the compound even in daylight. In the distance, Hans could see the medical building, a long structure with a red cross painted on its roof. That was where Captain William Carter worked. William Carter stood at the window of his office, watching the prisoners assemble for roll call. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a tall man in his 30s, with dark hair graying prematurely at the temples and lines of exhaustion carved deep around his eyes. He hadn't slept well in months, not since the telegram arrived about his brother. Lieutenant James Carter had died at the Battle of the Bulge, killed by German machine gun fire during the desperate winter fighting in the Ardennes. William had read the official letter so many times he could recite it from memory. Your brother died bravely in service to his country, as if that made the loss easier to bear. Now, every day, William treated the men who might have killed his brother. He set their broken bones, treated their infections, prescribed medication for their ailments. It was his duty as a medical officer, his obligation under the Geneva Convention. But that didn't make it simple. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Robert Hayes entered, carrying a clipboard. Hayes was a veteran medic, 20 years older than William, with the steady competence of a man who had seen everything. Morning, Captain. Got the weekly report on the disabled prisoners. William took the clipboard, scanning the numbers. 37 amputees currently in the camp. Most had lost limbs in combat, a few to frostbite or infection. All of them were struggling with mobility, using makeshift crutches or hobbling on canes fashioned from tree branches. We're running low on basic medical supplies, Hayes said, and these men need more than bandages. William knew what he meant. He had watched the amputees navigate the camp, their movements painful and labored. Some couldn't make it to the mess hall without help. Others spent entire days lying in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, trapped in bodies that no longer worked the way they should. What they need are prosthetics, William said quietly. Hayes raised an eyebrow. For German prisoners, for human beings. William set down the clipboard. These men are going to survive the war, Sergeant. When they go home, They'll need to work, to support families, to rebuild. Right now, they can barely walk across a room. With respect, sir, we can barely get enough supplies for our own wounded. The brass isn't going to approve resources for POWs. William nodded slowly. Hayes was right, of course. The war was still raging, and every scrap of metal, every piece of equipment, was needed for the front lines. Asking for materials to build artificial limbs for enemy soldiers would be seen as wasteful at best, treasonous at worst. But the image of those men struggling on their crude crutches wouldn't leave his mind. Let me think about it, William said finally. After Hayes left, William sat down at his desk and pulled out a leather notebook. Inside were sketches he had made during medical school. Designs for simple prosthetic devices. Nothing sophisticated, just basic structures of wood and metal that could restore some functionality to an amputated limb. The more he studied the drawings, the more he realized it might be possible. The camp had a workshop where prisoners made furniture and did carpentry. There was scrap metal in the maintenance building, leather scraps from the cobbler's shop. With ingenuity and determination, they could build something. But would anyone support him? Hans had stopped counting the days. Time in the camp moved strangely, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of roll calls, meals, and empty hours. Some prisoners tried to stay busy teaching classes, forming work details, organizing athletic competitions. But for the disabled men, participation in camp life was limited. He sat outside the barracks in the weak afternoon sun, watching a group of prisoners play soccer on the dusty field. Hans had been a runner before the war, competing in regional track meets in Bavaria. He could still remember the feeling of his legs pumping, his lungs burning, the finish line approaching. Now, watching others move freely felt like a special kind of torture. Friedrich settled onto the bench beside him, breathing heavily from the effort of walking across the yard. "Beautiful day," Friedrich said in German, though his tone suggested he found nothing beautiful about it. "Yes," Hans replied automatically. They sat in silence for a while, two crippled men watching the world continue without them. Finally, Friedrich spoke again. "My youngest daughter would be turning 7 next month. Elizabeth. She used to run to greet me when I came home from work." He paused. "I wonder if she'll even remember me." Hans had no answer to that. His own family seemed impossibly distant, his mother in Munich, his 2 sisters, his father who had died before the war began. Even if he made it home, what would he become? A burden, unable to work, unable to contribute. In Germany's ruins, there would be no place for broken soldiers. "Sometimes I think about what happens after," Friedrich continued. "After we're repatriated, how do we live? I was a factory foreman. That requires standing for 12 hours a day, walking between machines, climbing stairs. How do I do that on one leg?" "You don't," Hans said simply. Friedrich nodded, accepting the brutal honesty. "Then what? Sit in a corner and beg? Become a burden to my wife? If she's even still alive?" These were the questions that haunted all of them. The war would end eventually, that much was certain, though whether in German victory or defeat no longer seemed to matter. But the end of the war wouldn't restore their bodies. It wouldn't give them back what they had lost. Across the yard, Hans noticed an American soldier approaching. Not a guard, but someone in medical corps insignia. He walked with purpose, his gaze scanning the disabled prisoners scattered around the compound. It was Captain Carter, the camp doctor. William had made his decision. He spent the previous evening in the workshop, examining the available materials and tools. The camp carpenter, a prisoner named Otto Schmidt, who had been a furniture maker in Bremen, had shown him what they had to work with. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Now William was conducting his own survey, observing how the disabled men moved, what they needed, what might be possible. He approached the 2 men sitting on the bench, outside Barrack 7. "Good afternoon," he said in careful German. His pronunciation was rough, learned from a phrasebook, but understandable. The younger man, Hans, looked up with surprise. The older one, Friedrich, nodded cautiously. "I'm Captain Carter." I run the medical facility. William gestured to Friedrich's missing leg. May I ask how long since the amputation? 8 months. Friedrich replied in halting English. Italy. William nodded, making notes on a small pad. And you? He turned to Hans. 3 months. France. The crutches are painful. Hans held up the wooden supports, showing where they had worn raw patches on his skin. Always. William examined the crude devices, noting their poor construction and inadequate padding. These men deserved better. All of them deserved better. What if? William said slowly. There was another way. Not crutches, but something more permanent. Something that would let you walk again. Really. Walk. Hans and Friedrich exchanged glances, uncertain if they understood correctly. You mean artificial legs? Friedrich asked. Yes, prosthetics. We could build them here, in the camp workshop. The hope that flashed across their faces was almost painful to see. But just as quickly, it faded, replaced by the resignation of men who had learned not to hope too much. For us? Hans said. Why would Americans do this for Germans? It was the question William had been asking himself all night. He thought of his brother James, buried somewhere in Belgium. He thought of the hatred that had consumed him when the telegram arrived. The rage that made him want to punish every German soldier he encountered. But these men sitting before him weren't the enemy anymore. They were patients. They were human beings facing a future of disability and dependence, through no fault of their own except that they had been born in the wrong country at the wrong time. Because it's the right thing to do, William said finally. Because you're under my medical care, and I took an oath to help the sick and injured. That oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality. The proposal William submitted to the camp commander, Colonel James Thornton, was met with exactly the skepticism he expected. Artificial limbs, Thornton repeated, leaning back in his desk chair. For German prisoners. Yes, sir. Using materials and man-hours that could be devoted to our own war effort. Materials that would otherwise go unused, sir. Scrap wood, salvaged metal, leather remnants. Nothing that's currently allocated for military purposes. Thornton stroked his jaw, considering. He was a career officer, 52 years old, who had learned that the rules of war were rarely as clear-cut as people wanted them to be. The Geneva Convention requires us to provide medical care, William pressed. These men need mobility assistance. Without it, they're at risk for additional medical complications, infections from poorly fitted crutches, falls, deteriorating mental health from immobility. You're arguing this is a medical necessity? I'm arguing it's our responsibility, sir. And? William paused, choosing his next words carefully. There's also the matter of how we want history to remember how America treated its prisoners. Thornton's expression shifted slightly. That argument had weight. There were already concerns about how German POW camps were treating Allied prisoners. Demonstrating American commitment to humane treatment could have diplomatic value. I'm not authorizing significant resources, Thornton said finally. But if you can do this with scrap materials and volunteer labor, I won't stop you. Consider it an experiment. If it works, we'll reassess. It was enough. William assembled his team that afternoon. Sergeant Hayes, despite his initial skepticism, agreed to help. Otto Schmidt, the camp carpenter, volunteered immediately when he learned what they were attempting. Several other prisoners with relevant skills, a metal worker, a leather worker, a former medical orderly joined the effort. The workshop became their laboratory. They worked in the evenings after regular duties, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of hot metal. The first challenge was finding a basic design that could be manufactured with limited tools and materials. William had brought his medical texts, which included diagrams of prosthetic limbs used in previous wars. The designs were simpler than modern prosthetics, basically wooden pylons with leather attachments and simple joints, but they could be effective. Otto proved invaluable. He understood wood in a way that went beyond mere carpentry, knowing which pieces would bear weight and which would splinter under stress. He showed them how to shape the sockets that would fit over the amputee's residual limbs, how to carve gentle curves that would distribute pressure evenly. The metal worker, Ernst Vogel, fabricated simple hinges from salvaged bed frames and maintenance equipment. Nothing fancy, but functional. The joints would allow basic flexion, enough to simulate a natural gait. For cushioning, they used leather scraps stuffed with cotton batting. The camp cobbler donated old boot leather for the suspension straps that would hold the prosthetics in place. After 2 weeks of evening work, they had completed their first prototype. Hans stood in the medical building, stripped to his undershorts, while William and Otto made final adjustments to the prosthetic leg. The workshop had built it to Hans's measurements, a wooden pylon attached to a curved socket designed to fit over his residual limb. William had padded the socket heavily with leather and cotton, knowing the first attempts would require significant adjustment. Getting the fit right was crucial. Too loose, and the prosthetic would slip and cause blisters. Too tight, and it would restrict circulation. "This may hurt at first," William warned as he helped Hans slide his residual limb into the socket. "Your skin needs time to toughen up. We'll need to build up your tolerance gradually." Hans gritted his teeth as the socket settled into place. The pressure was intense, strange, almost overwhelming. But it was also something. For the first time since the amputation, he had 2 legs again, even if one was wood and metal. William secured the leather straps around Hans's thigh, distributing the weight. Sergeant Hayes stood ready on one side, Otto on the other, prepared to catch Hans if he fell. "Whenever you're ready," William said quietly. Hans placed his hands on their shoulders and slowly transferred his weight onto the artificial leg. The sensation was bizarre. He could feel the pressure in his residual limb, the socket pushing against his skin. But there was no sensation below. No foot touching the ground. No ankle flexing, just an absence where his calf and foot should have been. But he was standing. Standing on 2 legs, bearing his own weight, without crutches. Tears began streaming down Hans's face before he could stop them. He had thought he would never stand like this again, never feel balanced and whole. And here, in a prisoner of war camp thousands of miles from home, an enemy doctor had given him back something he thought was lost forever. "Try a step," William encouraged. Hans lifted his good leg and moved it forward, then carefully swung the prosthetic leg through. The motion was awkward, mechanical, nothing like natural walking. But his artificial foot touched the ground, bore his weight, and held. Another step, then another. He was walking. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. By the next morning, every disabled prisoner knew that Hans Müller had walked again. They came to the medical building in a steady stream, asking if it was true, if they could see, if there might be hope for them too. Hans became a celebrity of sorts, demonstrating his prosthetic leg to clusters of amazed prisoners. The artificial limb was crude. Everyone could see that, and Hans's gait was halting and unnatural. But he was mobile. He was independent. He was, in a fundamental way, whole again. Friedrich was the second recipient. At 42, he had worried he might be too old. His residual limb, too damaged from the battlefield amputation. But Otto and his team built a prosthetic specifically for his measurements, and William spent hours adjusting the fit. When Friedrich took his first steps, his reaction was quieter than Hans's, but no less profound. He simply stood there, balancing on 2 legs, and whispered Danke over and over, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The workshop went into full production. Otto organized teams of prisoners, dividing the labor efficiently. Some shaped the wooden pylons, others worked on the leather fittings, others fabricated the metal joints. It became a collaborative effort that crossed the usual camp division's officers, worked alongside enlisted men, Prussians alongside Bavarians, all united in a common purpose. William found himself working longer hours than ever, fitting each prosthetic individually, making adjustments, monitoring for complications. Some recipients developed pressure sores that required treatment. Others needed multiple fittings before achieving a comfortable fit. But slowly, steadily, the number of men able to walk without crutches grew. The change in the camp atmosphere was palpable. The disabled prisoners, who had spent months isolated and despondent, began participating in camp life again. They could stand in the meal line without assistance. They could walk to the latrines without help. They could move through the compound with dignity. And something unexpected happened. The barrier between Americans and Germans began to soften. It started small. Otto would explain his work to American guards who stopped by the workshop out of curiosity. Hans would attempt conversation with the medics who checked his prosthetic regularly. Friedrich, who spoke better English than most, began translating for other prisoners who wanted to express their gratitude. William found himself the recipient of small gifts, crude sketches drawn by prisoners, carved wooden figurines, a carefully pressed wildflower. These men had nothing, but they wanted to give something back. One evening, a prisoner named Klaus Werner approached William in the medical building. Klaus was 54, a veteran of the First World War who had been called back to service in 1943. He had lost his left leg to frostbite on the Eastern Front. Klaus spoke no English, so Friedrich translated. "He wants to know why you're doing this," Friedrich said. "He says in all his years as a soldier, he has never seen an enemy show such kindness. He wants to understand." William looked at Klaus, seeing the genuine confusion in the older man's eyes. How to explain? How to articulate something he was still working out himself? "Tell him," William said slowly, "that I had a brother who died fighting in Germany. When I first came to this camp, I was angry. I wanted revenge. In whatever small way I could take it." Friedrich translated, and Klaus nodded, understanding that emotion. "But then I realized," William continued, "that revenge doesn't bring anyone back. It doesn't heal anything. The only thing we can do, the only meaningful thing, is to try to reduce the suffering in the world, wherever we find it. Even here, even with former enemies." Klaus listened to the translation, then said something in German that made Friedrich smile sadly. "He says you have given him back more than his leg. You have given him back his faith in humanity." Not everyone approved of the prosthetic program. As word spread beyond the camp, William began receiving pointed questions from higher command. A letter arrived from the regional POW administration questioning the allocation of resources. Another came from the Provost Marshal General's office, requesting a detailed justification of the program. There were concerns about public perception. How would it look if newspapers reported that America was providing artificial limbs to German soldiers while American amputees sometimes waited months for prosthetics? Colonel Thornton called William into his office to discuss the growing pressure. "The brass is nervous," Thornton said bluntly. "There are congressmen asking questions. Veterans groups are raising concerns. The argument is that we should be taking care of our own first. We are taking care of our own, sir. These men are under our care, in our custody. That makes them our responsibility. You know what I mean, Captain." American soldiers. William did know. And he understood the political concerns. But he also understood that morality didn't change based on convenience. "Sir, this program uses scrap materials and volunteer labor. It costs the military essentially nothing, and it demonstrates to the world that America treats prisoners humanely, that we honor the Geneva Convention not just in letter but in spirit. That has strategic value." Thornton sighed. "I agree with you, William. But I need you to be prepared for the possibility that they'll shut this down anyway." 2 weeks later, Brigadier General Marcus Donnelly arrived for an inspection. He was a stern man in his 50s, a career officer who had served in both world wars. His reputation was that of a hardliner, someone who believed in military discipline and traditional hierarchy. William gave him a tour of the medical facility, showing him the treatment rooms, the pharmacy, the recovery wards. Throughout, Donnelly asked sharp questions, his expression neutral and unreadable. Finally, they reached the workshop. Otto and his team were in the middle of constructing 3 new prosthetics, the smell of sawdust and hot metal filling the air. Several recipients of earlier prosthetics were present, demonstrating their mobility to new candidates. Donnelly watched in silence for several minutes. Then he asked to speak with some of the recipients. Through Friedrich's translation, he interviewed Hans, Klaus, and several others. He asked about their injuries, their treatment, their experience with the artificial limbs. The prisoners answered honestly, their gratitude evident even through the language barrier. After nearly an hour, Donnelly asked to speak with William privately. "Captain Carter, I came here prepared to shut this program down," he said bluntly. "I thought it was a waste of resources and a misguided expression of sentiment." William's heart sank. "But," Donnelly continued, "having seen it firsthand, I've changed my mind. This is exactly the kind of program we should be running. It costs us almost nothing and demonstrates American values in the clearest possible way. Moreover," he paused, looking back at the workshop, "these men are going home eventually. When they do, they'll remember how they were treated. That memory will last longer than any propaganda." Relief flooded through William. "Then you'll allow us to continue?" "Continue?" "Captain, I'm going to recommend this as a model for other POW camps. I want a detailed report on your methods, materials, and outcomes. If this works here, it should work elsewhere." Over the following months, the prosthetic program expanded beyond anything William had initially imagined. With Donnelly's support, the camp received approval to obtain additional materials, not lavish supplies, but enough to improve the quality and efficiency of production. Otto's workshop became a training center, teaching carpentry techniques to other prisoners who wanted to help. Ernst Vogel established a small foundry for metalwork, producing better joints and fittings. The camp cobbler, an Austrian named Joseph Hartmann, developed a specialized technique for creating comfortable leather sockets. By spring 1945, they had produced prosthetics for nearly 40 amputees. The camp's disabled population had been transformed from a collection of immobile, despondent men into active participants in camp life. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical benefits. Men who had spent months in depression began engaging with others again. They formed a support group, sharing tips on adjusting to prosthetic use and encouraging newcomers. Some even developed a dark humor about their situation. They called themselves Otto's Army, after the carpenter who built their artificial limbs. Hans became a mentor to new recipients, teaching them how to walk with the prosthetics, how to care for their residual limbs, how to manage the inevitable frustrations. He had developed a surprisingly effective gait and could now move around the camp with relative ease. Friedrich took on a different role, serving as a liaison between the German prisoners and American staff. His English had improved dramatically through daily practice, and he had a diplomatic manner that helped smooth over the occasional cultural misunderstanding. The workshop became a gathering place, a neutral zone where Germans and Americans worked side by side. William spent hours there, consulting with Otto on designs, discussing improvements, learning carpentry techniques he never imagined he would need as a doctor. One evening in April, as William was adjusting a particularly difficult prosthetic fitting, Otto approached him with unusual formality. "Captain Carter," he said in his careful English, "I want to show you something." Otto led him to a workbench in the corner, where a beautiful wooden box sat, inlaid with different types of wood in an intricate geometric pattern. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. "I made this for you," Otto said, "to say thank you." William opened the box. Inside was a complete set of small carpentry tools, each one perfectly fitted into a custom slot. "You have given us back our lives," Otto continued, his voice thick with emotion. "This is a very small thing in comparison, but I want you to know what you did here. It will be remembered. When we go home to Germany, we will tell our families, we will tell our children, we will tell anyone who will listen about the American doctor who saw us as human beings." William didn't trust himself to speak. He simply gripped Otto's shoulder in acknowledgement. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The news swept through Camp Hearne with mixed emotions. For the American guards, it was celebration the war in Europe was over, and many would be going home soon. For the German prisoners, it was more complicated. Relief that the killing had stopped, certainly, but also deep anxiety about what they would find when they returned. Hans stood with Friedrich and Klaus, watching as American soldiers celebrated in the distance. They knew that soon, they would be repatriated. The prospect was both hopeful and terrifying. "Hamburg was bombed heavily," Friedrich said quietly. "The Red Cross lists. There's been no word of my family. Munich too," Hans added. My mother's neighborhood was in the path of the bombing raids. Klaus, the oldest among them, put a hand on each man's shoulder. Whatever we find, at least we go home standing on our own feet. That's more than we had any right to expect. The repatriation process began in June. It would take months to transport thousands of prisoners back across the Atlantic, and the men from Camp Hearne would leave in groups based on their home regions. William made sure each prosthetic recipient received a complete maintenance kit. Extra padding, leather straps, tools for adjustments, and detailed written instructions in German for caring for the artificial limbs. He also wrote detailed medical records for each man, documenting their injuries and treatment, which would help German doctors provide continued care. The night before the first group departed, there was an informal gathering in the camp yard. American guards and German prisoners mingled with an ease that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Someone had produced a harmonica, and music drifted across the compound. Hans sought out William, finding him standing apart from the main group. "Captain Carter," Hans said, "I want to tell you something." William turned, and Hans was struck again by how much older the American doctor looked than when they had first met. The war had aged everyone. "When I lost my leg," Hans began, "I believed my life was over. Not just ended, but without meaning. I had been taught that weakness was shameful, that a man who could not fight had no value. Do you understand?" William nodded. "You showed me that was a lie," Hans continued. "You showed me that even broken, I still had worth. That even as an enemy, I was still a human being. I don't think I can ever fully repay that gift." "You don't need to repay anything," William said. "But I do." Hans met his eyes directly. "When I return to Germany, I will rebuild. I will find work, have a family, contribute to society, and I will teach my children what you taught me, that humanity transcends nationality, that compassion is stronger than hatred, that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose to do the right thing." He extended his hand, and William shook it firmly. "Thank you, Captain William Carter. I will never forget what you did for me, for all of us." The repatriation ships departed from New York Harbor throughout the summer and fall of 1945. Hans was on one of the early transports, along with Friedrich and several dozen other men from Camp Hearne. They stood on deck as the Statue of Liberty receded in the distance, watching America disappear beyond the horizon. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. The ship was crowded with repatriated prisoners, all heading home to an uncertain future. Some were optimistic, others despairing. All were changed by what they had experienced. Hans spent much of the voyage below deck, teaching other amputees how to care for their prosthetics. Many had received artificial limbs from various POW camps. The program started at Camp Hearne had spread to other facilities, just as General Donnelly had planned. Hans had become something of an expert, and he shared his knowledge freely. Friedrich spent his time writing letters long, detailed accounts to his family if they survived, or simply to record his experiences if they had not. He wrote about the camp, about the Americans, about Otto's workshop and Captain Carter's determination. He wrote about learning to walk again, about finding hope in an unexpected place. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven, the returning prisoners were met by Red Cross workers and German officials who processed their papers and arranged transportation to their home regions. The Germany they had left was gone. In its place was a landscape of rubble and displacement, a nation struggling to comprehend the magnitude of its defeat. Hans made his way to Munich, traveling on foot for much of the journey. His prosthetic leg held up remarkably well, though he had to make several adjustments along the way. The city he found was barely recognizable, whole neighborhoods reduced to ruins, survivors living in cellars and damaged buildings, food scarce and hope scarcer. But his mother had survived. She wept when she opened the door and found her son standing there, whole and alive when so many families had lost everyone. Hans introduced her to his artificial leg as if it were an old friend, telling her the story of the American doctor who had built it. Friedrich's homecoming was more bittersweet. His wife, Anna, had survived, living in the basement of their bombed apartment building. But his youngest daughter, Elizabeth, had died in an air raid in 1944. His two older children were alive, though traumatized and malnourished. That first night, reunited with what remained of his family, Friedrich showed them his prosthetic leg and told them about Camp Hearne. He told them about Americans who saw German soldiers not as enemies to be punished, but as human beings deserving of care. Anna wept, not just from grief for all they had lost, but from relief that in such a terrible war, such kindness had still existed. Klaus returned to his hometown near Stuttgart to find it largely intact but desperately poor. At 54, with one leg, he struggled to find work. But he had learned carpentry from Otto, and he began making small items to sell toys, boxes, simple furniture. Eventually, word spread about his skills, and a local doctor approached him with an unusual request. There were many amputees in the region, veterans who had lost limbs and now struggled with mobility. Could Klaus build artificial limbs, as had been done for him in America? Klaus remembered everything Otto had taught him. He set up a small workshop, obtained materials wherever he could find them, and began building prosthetics. His work was rough at first, but he improved with practice. Within a year, he had helped dozens of men regain their mobility. He never charged more than people could afford, often working for barter, a prosthetic leg in exchange for food or materials, or simply a promise to help someone else in need. When people asked why he was so generous, he told them about Captain William Carter and Camp Hearne. The years passed. Germany rebuilt, slowly and painfully. The economic miracle of the 1,950 seconds brought prosperity back to the shattered nation. But the men who had been at Camp Hearne never forgot what happened there. Hans became a teacher, working with disabled children in Munich. He openly wore his prosthetic leg, never trying to hide it, and used his own experience to inspire students facing their own challenges. On the wall of his classroom, he kept a photograph, one of the few he owned, showing him with Captain Carter and Otto Schmidt in the workshop at Camp Hearne. He told his students the story every year, about the war that had taken his leg, and the enemy doctor who had given him back his future, about the power of choosing compassion over hatred, even when hatred would have been easier. Friedrich worked as an accountant in Hamburg, his prosthetic leg allowing him to return to productive civilian life. He became active in reconciliation efforts between Germany and America, speaking publicly about his experiences as a POW. He maintained correspondence with several of the American guards from Camp Hearne, and in 1962, he traveled to Texas to visit the site of the old camp. The buildings were mostly gone, converted back to farmland. But the maintenance shed that had housed Otto's workshop still stood. Friedrich stood there for a long time, remembering the sound of sawing wood and hammering metal, the smell of leather and sawdust, the quiet determination of men working to restore hope. Klaus's workshop grew into a small prosthetics manufacturing business. His 3 sons joined him in the work, and together they helped hundreds of amputees regain mobility. Klaus insisted that they follow the principles he had learned at Camp Hearne, that every person deserved dignity, that quality mattered more than profit, that their work was about healing, not just manufacturing. On his 75th birthday, Klaus was interviewed by a local newspaper about his life and work. He spent most of the interview talking about an American doctor he had known for only 18 months, more than 30 years earlier. "Captain Carter taught me something I had forgotten during the war," Klaus said. "He taught me that we are all human beings first, and everything else, nationality, language, politics, comes second. When you see someone suffering and you have the ability to help, you help. It's that simple." The interviewer asked if he had ever tried to contact Captain Carter, to let him know the impact he had made. "I wrote to him several times after the war," Klaus replied. "I never received a response. I don't know if the letters reached him, or if perhaps he preferred not to look back at that time. But it doesn't matter. What he did for me, for all of us, is written in how we live our lives." That's the real tribute. Captain William Carter returned to civilian life in 1946, setting up a medical practice in a small town in Pennsylvania. He rarely spoke about his time at Camp Hearne, even to his wife and children. The loss of his brother James remained a wound that never fully healed, and the war years were too painful to revisit regularly. But he kept a box in his study, the beautiful wooden box Otto Schmidt had made for him. Inside were the carpentry tools, along with letters from German prisoners he had treated. Some of the letters were in English, others in German that he had had translated. All of them expressed gratitude that he struggled to accept fully. Had he really done something so remarkable? He had simply seen men suffering and tried to help them. That was a doctor's job, wasn't it? The oath he had taken demanded nothing less. Yet the letters kept coming, year after year. Hans wrote about becoming a teacher. Friedrich described his reconciliation work. Klaus sent a photograph of his workshop, with a note explaining how he was carrying on the tradition started at Camp Hearne. In 1975, William received an invitation to a reunion of Camp Hearne veterans, both American and German. He almost didn't go. He was 70 years old, his health declining, and the past seemed better left undisturbed, but his wife encouraged him. "Those men want to thank you," she said. "Let them." The reunion was held in Houston. 40 former prisoners made the journey from Germany, along with nearly 100 American veterans who had served as guards, administrators, and medical staff at the camp. William walked into the hotel ballroom to find Hans, Friedrich, and Klaus waiting for him. They were old men now, in their 60s and 70s, but they moved toward him with surprising speed. All three were still using the prosthetic legs built 30 years earlier, maintained and repaired, but fundamentally the same devices that had been crafted in Otto's workshop. They embraced him, these former enemies, weeping openly. Around them, others gathered prisoners William had treated, Americans he had worked alongside. Families of the men whose lives had been changed by a simple act of compassion. "You gave us back our futures," Hans said, his English now fluent after decades of practice. "We raised children, built careers, lived full lives, all because you chose to see us as human beings rather than enemies," Friedrich added. "We have tried to honor that gift by living with the same compassion you showed us. Every person we've helped, every moment we've chosen kindness over hatred, that's your legacy, Captain." Klaus, the oldest present, spoke last. "The war took much from all of us, but what we found at Camp Hearne, what you gave us, was the reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, there are those who choose light over darkness. You were that light for us." William couldn't speak. His throat was tight with emotion, his eyes burning. He had thought of his time at Camp Hearne as simply doing his job, fulfilling his obligations as a doctor. He had never imagined it would matter so much, would ripple outwards so far. That night, the reunion organizers showed a documentary they had created about the Camp Hearne prosthetic program. It featured interviews with dozens of recipients, their families, and their communities. It showed Klaus's workshop in Germany, still operating, now run by his grandsons. It showed Hans in his classroom, teaching disabled children that their limitations did not define them. It showed Friedrich speaking at a reconciliation conference, preaching the gospel of common humanity. At the end of the film, there was a dedication to Captain William Carter and all those who proved that compassion knows no borders, and that our shared humanity is stronger than our divisions. The audience stood and applauded for nearly 10 minutes. Later, sitting quietly with Hans, Friedrich, and Klaus, William finally understood. What he had done at Camp Hearne wasn't remarkable because it was difficult or heroic. It was remarkable because it was simple human decency, extended across the lines of war, and in a world that had forgotten such things were possible, that simple decency had become revolutionary. "Thank you," he said to the three men. "Not just for tonight, but for showing me that what we did mattered. For proving that choosing compassion over hatred was the right decision, even when it seemed questionable." "No, Captain," Hans replied. "Thank you. For giving us back not just our legs, but our dignity. For reminding us that we were human beings worthy of care and respect. For teaching us a lesson we spent the rest of our lives trying to pass on." The four old men sat together as the party continued around them, former enemies united by a shared experience of humanity at its best. The war had tried to make them see each other as less than human, as objects to be destroyed. But in a workshop in Texas, surrounded by sawdust and scrap metal, they had discovered something stronger than hatred. They had discovered that even in war's darkest moments, compassion could triumph, that even between enemies, there could be healing, that the simple act of seeing another person's suffering and choosing to alleviate it could echo across decades, across continents, across the vast gulf of history. That was the gift Captain William Carter had given them, and they, in turn, had given it to countless others. As the reunion wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, Hans pulled out a photograph. It showed a young man standing in Otto's workshop at Camp Hearne, taking his first steps on a wooden prosthetic leg, tears streaming down his face while an American doctor steadied him. "This is the moment my life began again," Hans said. "I have shown this picture to my children, my grandchildren, anyone who will look. I tell them this is what the world can be, when we choose to see the humanity in each other." He handed the photograph to William. "I made copies for all of us, but I wanted you to have the original, so you would always remember what you meant to us." William took the photograph with trembling hands, looking at the faces frozen in that moment, his younger self, barely recognizable now, and Hans, so young and broken and hopeful. It was a moment of pure human connection, transcending everything that should have kept them apart. "I'll treasure this," William said softly. "Good," Friedrich added. "Because that moment, that choice you made to help us, it didn't just change our lives. It changed how we saw the world. It taught us that kindness is always possible, even in the cruelest circumstances. That's a lesson worth remembering, worth passing on." Klaus raised his glass. They were drinking simple beer, nothing fancy in a toast. "To Captain William Carter, to Otto Schmidt, to all those who chose compassion over hatred, may their example light the way for future generations." They drank together, these old warriors, united not by what had divided them, but by what had healed them. And in that moment, in a hotel ballroom in Houston, Texas, the true victory of World War II was quietly celebrated, not the victory of one nation over another, but the victory of human decency over the forces that would make us forget our common humanity. The gift Captain Carter had given those German prisoners wasn't just artificial legs. It was the reminder that they were human beings deserving of dignity and care, and they had spent the rest of their lives trying to give that same gift to others, creating a legacy of compassion that would outlast all of them. That was the real triumph. Not the battles won or the territories conquered, but the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to help another human being, even when everything said they were your enemy. That choice, repeated thousands of times in small workshops and medical offices and classrooms, had changed the world more than any weapon ever could. And it all began with a simple question. What if we treated our enemies as human beings? The answer, as Hans and Friedrich and Klaus and so many others proved, was that treating people with dignity and compassion could transform not just individuals but entire communities, creating ripples of kindness that spread far beyond anyone's imagination. That was the legacy of Camp Hearne. That was the gift of standing not just the physical ability to walk, but the restoration of hope, dignity, and faith in humanity's capacity for goodness. And it was a gift that would never be forgotten.